Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? This is the 6th installment in the Weapons series where I finally get down to answering some of those questions I asked in the first installment. So I'm going to cover a few of those question categories now and give you my take on like what I think is, an easier thing to use or a better thing to use in your game. And of course you might have different opinions, but I'm just going to give you what I've kind of come up with looking at all this sort of thing. The questions would be, first I'm going to kind of tackle are what weapons should the various classes be able to use and or simply be proficient in, and how should these classes differ in overall prowess? And second of all, what should happen if you use a weapon that you're not supposed to use or you're simply not proficient in? What should the penalties be for something like that? Now, something like prowess is really easy to handle because I think the games have already done that really well. The idea that there's different attack tables, there's different rates of progression for something like DACO or attack bonus, it really differentiates the classes, just from the get-go. The idea that fighters progress really well, that magic users really progress crappy, and that clerics and thieves are somewhere in the middle in terms of progressing makes a lot of sense. So it divides them up in prowess, very organically that way, and it's done it very well for years. Now, in terms of actual slots, like you want to give people more opportunity for mastery or specialization, I think, I don't like the whole idea of having to buy just the ability to use a weapon. I really like that basic and Pathfinder idea that you're proficient in these weapons that you're allowed to use from the get-go. But, wanting to become more specialized on via like specialization or weapon mastery, I think that's pretty cool. But I think that different classes should get slots at different rates, just like they do in first edition. You should kind of differentiate the classes that way. And maybe, something like the highest number should go to the fighter, even more than rangers and paladins. Maybe like different classes should have different ceilings in terms of how specialized they can actually become with weapons. Maybe the fighter can get super specialized. Maybe rangers and paladins need some kind of ceiling. Maybe the wizard shouldn't be able to get specialized at all, or maybe just a little bit. And clerics and thieves somewhere in the middle. And of course, it's up to you how you want to do that. But I like the idea of maybe like giving some like top levels in terms of like how badass you're going to get with a particular weapon at any given time. In terms of what weapons should classes be proficient in from the get-go, I like the standard list an awful lot. The Pathfinder list for wizards is actually pretty cool because they're all very simple weapons. There's a few weapons that aren't on the normal like first edition tables, but they're simple. Things like the club. And then of course, you got the dagger. The heavy and light crossbow, those are simple weapons to use. They didn't give them the dart, but of course the dart's a pretty simple thing. You just chuck it. And the staff, that's pretty standard. And of course you can do whatever you want for the different classes. But I like the idea that they're just proficient at these weapons to start off with because they're simple. They don't even give the wizard in even a game like Pathfinder all the simple weapons. They give them some of them, and they're pretty standard for the most part. Now, in terms of what should happen, when you're using a weapon that you're not proficient in. This is an interesting thing, and I actually did a pretty big study on this, comparing the idea of weapons mastery half damage when you're using a weapon that you're just not proficient in versus the idea of something like a Pathfinder where you get a flat -4, and something like first edition where it's going to range from -2 if you're a fighter to -5 if you're a wizard, and clerics and thieves are somewhere in the middle there with -2. Or -3 and -4. And so what I did was I took the 20 natural rolls that you might need in order to be able to hit something you're actually able to hit. And what I mean by natural roll is after you add your THACO or attack bonus, after you figure in any magical bonuses, strength bonuses, dexterity bonus, whatever going to give you an opportunity or an extra or a penalty to hit, you're going to have 20 natural rolls that are going to hit something. Now what happens when you use a negative to hit because you're using a non-proficient weapon versus doing a half damage? And so I used a damage per round figure. Now, one of the first things that happens, before you look at the damage per round, is it's always a little bit better to use a weapon that gives a half damage because you're going to hit them. Maybe they have low hit points. Maybe you want to just keep the battle going. Maybe you're trying to disrupt a spell. So I think it's a little bit, better to have a weapon that does half damage overall when you're not proficient with it. And to be honest with you, the idea that something like Rule Cyclopedia gives you a -1 to hit with a missile weapon that you're not proficient with because it's a little harder to throw or shoot something at somebody versus being standing right in front of them. And say you've got a mace and you're not really good at it, but the idea that you should be able to at least hit them and maybe do some damage, to me makes more sense and makes for a more fun game. Even though it might not make sense to people that know an awful lot about weapons, it just makes it more fun for me, to have something like that happen rather than you just miss, the game sucks. So, when does half damage actually become better in terms of damage per round than having some kind of penalty. Well, I looked at 3 different types of weapons. I looked at one that did D6 damage, one that does D8 damage, and one that does 2D4. And the reason I did that is because half damage, when you're looking at averages, isn't always half. When you're using a D6 weapon, average damage is 3.5. But when you make that a D3 weapon, now the average damage is 2. When you're using a D8 weapon, average damage is 4.5. When you're making a D4 weapon, average damage is 2.5. And finally, with something like a 2D4 weapon, average damage is 5. But the average damage for half is, of course, exactly half. It's in 1D4. It's 2.5. So when do these weapons doing half damage actually become better than the weapons that you just have a penalty to hit? Well, actually, when it's really easy to hit somebody with your natural rolls, you're always going to do more damage with a weapon that takes a negative to hit. But finally, you're going to get to the point where the half damage weapon does more average damage per round. If you only have a -1 penalty for some reason, with a D6 or D8 weapon, you're only going to get better with a half damage weapon in terms of average damage per round when you need a natural roll of 19. With a 2D4 weapon, you're going to be equal at 19, and you're finally going to get better in terms of average damage per round at needing a natural roll of 20. When it's -2, so you're like a fighter, you're finally going to get better with a D6 or D8 weapon when you need a natural roll of 17. A 2D4 weapon, you're going to get equal at 17. You're finally going to get better average damage per round at 18. So maybe you're -3, you're like a cleric. You're going to need a 30% chance or 15 to become better with a half damage weapon at a D6, but you actually become equal with them at needing a natural roll of 14. D8, you need a natural roll of 13 to finally become better with a half damage weapon. And with a 2D4 weapon, of course, you're equal at needing a 15, but you're actually better when you need a 16. With -4, now the standard Pathfinder motif of all weapons that you don't know how to use, you're at a -4 versus half damage. Half damage is going to be better at needing a natural roll of 12 when you're using a D6 weapon. It's going to be equal using a D8 weapon at 12, but it's going to be a little better at a 13. And then for using a 2D4 weapon, it's actually going to be equal at 13, but finally better at 14. So when a lot of the monsters that you're going to try to hit, you're going to need a pretty high roll in most games. So, already a half damage weapon, you've got a better chance of success of doing more damage. And like I said before, when you're doing miss, game's not so fun. And finally, at a -5, you're a wizard. When do you become better in terms of average damage with a half damage weapon versus your standard -5 penalty? Well, with a D6 weapon or a D8 weapon on a roll, when you need a roll of 10, naturally, after all your bonuses, you're actually better. You're doing more damage with a half damage weapon. And with a 2D4, then it's equal at an 11, and it's actually better at a roll of 12 in terms of the natural roll that you need. So, I like the idea of having weapons that you're simply not proficient in doing half damage because it tends to make the game a little bit more fun. It's not going to be miss all the time. And also, it differs in terms of which is better based on whether something's really easy to hit and whether something's really hard to hit. And, when something's really hard to hit, it gives you a little bit of an edge having this weapon that does half damage. But I think it makes the game a little bit more fun that way to just have the weapons do half damage when you don't know what you're doing. And the idea that classes can just have a group of weapons to start out with that they actually know how to use and then can spend extra points or slots or whatever you want, in terms of getting just better at them or maybe, buying another weapon or something like that. So that's my take on that sort of thing, and I'll discuss some of the other topics later. Have a good one.